On the reading and writing section of your SAT, some questions will present two short texts for you to read. Cross-text connection questions give us twice as much data to consider, but both texts will cover the same subject. This is very important. You can see over here, you have text 1 and you have text 2, and then there will be a question based on these two texts. But one thing is very important that you must understand that both texts will cover the same subject. And this close interrelation means that each text will build your understanding of the other. Additionally, cross-text connection questions will always focus on points of view. This is very important. Now, what exactly is a point of view? It is basically an opinion or perspective of a person. In the context of the SAT, the opinion that we are looking at is that of the author of the passage or that of specific individuals named in the passage. For example, if I read the question over here, let's see what we are talking about. Based on the text, how would Caceres and colleagues, text 2, most likely describe the view of the theorists presented in text 1? So you see, so in this example, we are asked to consider the views of the theorists from text 1 and that of Caceres and colleagues from text 2. Now, once we have identified the individuals whose points of view the question asks about, we will usually need to consider whether those points of view agree or disagree. These are very important. These are a couple of combinations that you should already know before you read the question. The passages or points of view might agree with each other. They might disagree with each other. One passage might elaborate on the other passage. There can be partial agreement, partial disagreement as well. But please remember, the points of view we identify must directly be supported by the text. Please avoid any assumptions. This is very important. Avoid any assumptions. Whenever you choose your option choice, always give yourself reasoning from the passage. This is something that I always tell my students. Avoid choices that express opinions that are too extreme, that swap the points of view of different people, or that make claims that go beyond the specific focus of the text. Please remember this. Now let's read this example and apply a couple of strategies. We will read the question first. We have already read that. We know that we're looking at Caceres and colleagues, their point of view, and how they would most likely describe the view of the theorists presented in text 1. So let's begin. What factors influence the abundance of species in a given ecological community? Very important. You have a question mark over here. Another very important note to take over here is that introductory sentences are extremely important. Another thing that I tell all my students, whenever you are reading such kind of statements or paragraphs, focus on introductory sentences and conclusion statements. A lot of times, good authors will give you the thesis statement in the introductory sentence. Now, I already know that the entire paragraph will talk about the factors that influence the abundance of species in a given ecological community. By doing this, you can avoid a lot of extra details and you know exactly where to focus on. Now, let's continue. Some theorists have argued that historical diversity is a major driver of how diverse an ecological community eventually becomes. Historical diversity, okay? You have a colon, so it means that there's an explanation that is coming up, most probably. Differences in community diversity across otherwise similar habitats in this view are strongly affected by the number of species living in those habitats at earlier times. Now, what I usually do is, before moving on to the second text, I will sum up this text. You don't have to absorb all the information at once and then try summing up the information. No, that's a wrong strategy. If you can divide up the paragraphs, that is a lot better. So let's sum up this text first before we move on to the next text. I have already underlined the important points. If you can just join them together, you will have the summary. So this passage basically presents the view of a group of theorists about ecological diversity. Specifically, the theorists claim that historical diversity is a major driver of how diverse an ecological community eventually becomes. So if you have to sum it up, you can say more diversity early on leads to more diversity later as well. For me, this is more than enough to understand. I know I haven't written the entire text, but that's how I work. You have to save time. So now that I have summed up text 1, I will move on to text 2. In 2010, a group of researchers, including biologist Carla Caceres, created artificial pools in a New York forest. They stocked some pools with a diverse mix of zooplankton species and others with a single zooplankton species, and allowed the pool communities to develop naturally thereafter. Over the course of 4 years, Caceres and colleagues periodically measured the species diversity of the pools, finding, contrary to their expectations, transition words are very important, that by the end of the study, there was little to no difference in the pool's species diversity. Now you see what is happening? The text 2 is basically an experiment on the points of view that were presented in text 1. So now the first thing that you have to do is sum up this text, then we will determine the relationship, whether these texts agree with each other or disagree with each other. And if you look at the underlined portion, if you join them together, you will have the summary. So if I have to sum it up, simply I will say that more diversity early on does not necessarily make a difference. No difference. Again, for me, this is more than enough to understand. So you see, now you can clearly see that once we have summaries of each passage, we can see how the summaries relate to one another. And you must have seen that I have yet not looked at the option choices. This is something that you need to do before you jump onto the option choices. Now, in this case, our two texts are in disagreement. The claims of theorists in text 1 are not supported by the findings of the researchers in text 2. Now you can move on to the option choices. Option choice A says that it is largely correct, but it requires a minor refinement in light of the research team's results. This is definitely incorrect. Why? Because it suggests that despite their research findings, the scientists in text 2 think that the theory in text 1 is largely correct, but the research findings directly oppose the theory. And it's never suggested in text 2 that the researchers support the theory from text 1. We can easily eliminate option choice A. Let's read option choice B. It is not compelling as a theory regardless of any experimental data collected by the research team. Again, this is definitely incorrect. Why? Because it goes beyond what we learn about the researchers in text 2. Please, as I said earlier, whenever you choose an option choice, you have to justify it from reasoning. You have to justify it with evidence from the passage. And this is something that is not stated anywhere in both of the texts. Let's move on to option choice C. It may seem plausible, but it is not supported by the research team's findings. Only choice C identifies the same disagreement that we identified in our summaries. While the theory from text 1 sounds like it makes sense, the experiment in text 2 showed a different result. Choice C is definitely the answer. And did you see the wording over here? Please understand that you will never have extreme wording. It will always be like, yes, it may seem plausible, it is possible. So it will never be like, yes, that is the case. There are no absolute truths. So always keep this point in mind as well, that you will not use words like it is always correct, or it will never happen, or it is the only scenario. Please avoid such extreme words. Let's look at option choice D. It probably holds true only, look at this, in conditions like those in the research team's study. Choice D suggests that theorists' claim holds true in the researcher's study. We found exactly the opposite of this. So you can eliminate option choice D as well. Let's have a look at this question. Before you read the prompts, please read the question first. Based on the two texts, how would the author of text 1 most likely regard the situation presented in the underlined sentence in text 2? So the point of view of author 1 and how he or she will treat this sentence. Same thing. Now you can start reading the text. Although food writing is one of the most widely genres, although transition word very important, widely read genres in the United States, literary scholars have long neglected it. Again, the point that I raised earlier, introductory sentences are very important. If you're smart enough, you will clearly see that this is your main idea. And the rest of the paragraph will definitely talk about this sentence. And within this genre, cookbooks attract the least scholarly attention of all, regardless of how well written they may be. This is especially true of works dedicated to regional US cuisines, whose complexity and historical significance are often overlooked. So if you have to sum up this text, I won't write it because I've already underlined it. You know that text 1 basically says that literary scholars ignore regional cookbooks. Very simple. So you can come up with the statement in your head as well so that you can save time. Now let's move on to text 2. With the 1976 cookbook, The Taste of Country Cooking, Edna Lewis popularized the refined Southern cooking she had grown up with in Freetown, an all-black community in Virginia. She also set a new standard for cookbook writing. The recipes and memoir passages interspersing them are written in prose more elegant than that of most novels. Yet, despite its inarguable value as a piece of writing, Lewis's masterpiece has received almost no attention from literary scholars. Now, the first thing that you need to understand is you have to focus on this sentence and not the entire passage. And if you read the sentence again, you will see that it's also saying the same thing, that Lewis's masterpiece did not receive the attention that it should have received from literary scholars. So both the statements, basically text 1 and this statement, agree with each other. Now once we have determined the relationship, now you can move on to the option choices. So option choice A says that, as typical, because scholars are dismissive of literary works that achieve popularity with the general public. Dismissive is a very strong word and it shouldn't be used over here, and you cannot justify it. We can't infer that this is how author 1 would regard the situation. Text 1 never suggests that scholars are dismissive of popular works in general. Instead, text 1 says that scholars ignore food writing. But there is a huge difference between these words, ignore and dismissive. So be very careful. You can easily eliminate option choice A. Let's move on to option choice B. As unsurprising, because scholars tend to overlook the literary value of food writing in general and of regional cookbooks in particular. Yes, this is definitely the best choice. Text 1 states that literary scholars ignore regional cookbooks most of all. We've already discussed this, even when they have historical significance and are well written. So author 1 wouldn't be surprised that scholars ignored Edna Lewis's cookbook. Let's read option choice C. As justifiable, because Lewis incorporated memoir into the taste of the country cooking, thus undermining its status as a cookbook. You cannot infer this from the text. Why? Because text 1 never suggests that elements of other genres should be kept out of cookbooks. This goes beyond the scope of these two texts. Let's read option choice D. As inevitable, because the taste of country cooking was marketed to readers of food writing and not to readers of other genres. Again, this is something you can't infer. Text 1 never discusses how food writing is or should be marketed. Let's have a look at this question. Based on the text, what would Lisa Trevor, text 2, most likely say about the interpretation presented in the underlying portion of text 1? So Lisa Trevor's point of view and how she would treat this sentence. Let's read the text now. Historians studying pre-Inca Peru have looked to ceramic vessels to understand daily life among the Mosh people. These mold-made sculptures present plants, animals, and human faces in precise ways. Vessels representing human faces are so detailed that scholars have interpreted facial markings to represent scars and other skin irregularities. Some historians have even used these objects to identify potential skin diseases that may have afflicted people at the time. The first thing that I would do is summarize this text. And it is pretty simple. What I will write is, so we have basically highly detailed mosh sculptures. For me, this is more than enough to understand what the paragraph is talking about. Now let's move on to text 2. Art historian and archaeologist Lisa Trevor has argued that the interpretation of mosh portrait vessels as hyper-realistic portrayals of identifiable people may inadvertently disregard the creativity of objects' creators. Mosh ceramic vessels, Trevor argues, are artworks in which sculptors could free their imagination, using realistic objects and people around them as inspiration to explore more abstract concepts. Again, this is a pretty straightforward passage, and you can clearly see that both the passages disagree with each other. This is very important. You need to develop the connection first. How do we know that? Because Trevor says that hyper-realistic portrayals of identifiable people. This interpretation ignores the sculptor's imagination and creativity. So now, once you have done this much of work, you can move on to the option choices. Markings on depictions of human faces are not necessarily intended to portray particular details about the physical appearance of individuals. Yes, definitely yes, this is what we are talking about as well, because we've already discussed that the hyper-realistic portrayal of identifiable people, this interpretation ignores the sculptor's imagination and creativity and effort So we can infer that Trevor thinks the facial markings on the sculptures may not have represented real skin blemishes on real people. So this is an inference that you can draw from the information that is given in the text. Let's have a look at other option choices as well. Some vessels may have been damaged during their excavation and thus provide little insight into the Mosh culture. Definitely not. You can easily eliminate this. Why? Because the text gives us no reason to think that Trevor would respond to the underlying interpretation in this way. Neither text mentions the state of the vessels damaged or intact, so we have no basis to draw this conclusion. Let's have a look at option choice C. Depictions of human faces are significantly more realistic than depictions of plants and other animals are. Again, this is completely wrong. Why? Because the text gives us no reason to think that Trevor would respond to the underlying interpretation in this way. Neither text compares the depictions of human faces to depictions of plants or animals. So we have no basis to draw this conclusion. Let's have a look at option choice D. It is likely that some depictions of human faces with extensive markings are intended to portray the same historical individual. Again, this is incorrect. Why? Because the text gives us no reason to think that Trevor would respond to the underlying interpretation in this way. There is nothing in either text about multiple depictions representing the same person. So we have no basis, there is no evidence, there is no support to draw this conclusion. Hence, option choice A is definitely the correct answer. One more question. Which choice best describes a difference in how the authors of text 1 and text 2 view Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August? Okay, so the authors might agree with each other, they might disagree with each other. Let's read the text. Despite its beautiful prose, The Guns of August, Barbara Tuchman's 1962 analysis of the start of World War I has certain weaknesses as a work of history. I've underlined despite. Why? Because it's a transition word. It fails to address events in Eastern Europe just before the outbreak of hostilities, thereby giving the impression that Germany was the war's principal instigator. Had Tuchman consulted secondary works available to her by scholars such as Luigi Albertini, she would not have neglected the influence of events in Eastern Europe on Germany's actions. Now you know the drill. You have to sum up this paragraph, and it's quite obvious that it's a critique on The Guns of August, and the author of text 1 says that Barbara Tuchman should have consulted other secondary works. This would have made her argument more plausible. So this is the conclusion that we can easily draw from text 1. Now let's read text 2. Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August is an engrossing if dated introduction to World War I. Tuchman's analysis of primary documents is laudable, but her main thesis that European powers committed themselves to a catastrophic outcome by refusing to deviate from military plans developed prior to the conflict is implausibly reductive. So you can see that this is also a criticism of The Guns of August, but for a different reason. Author 2 basically says that her main thesis, Tuchman's main thesis, is simply, she uses the phrase implausibly reductive, which for me, that it's too plain or too easy or too simple. These are some words that you can use. So both the texts are basically criticisms on The Guns of August, but for different reasons. You can clearly see that author 1 argues that Tuchman missed an important factor leading up to the war because she didn't consult secondary sources. And author 2 argues that Tuchman's main thesis is reductive or too plain or too simple. Now you can move on to the option choices. The author of text 1 believes that the scope of Tuchman's research led her to an incorrect interpretation, while the author of text 2 believes that Tuchman's central argument is overly simplistic. I believe this is exactly what we were talking about as well. The author of text 1 definitely believes that the scope of Tuchman's research led her to an incorrect interpretation because she did not consult secondary sources, while the author of text 2 believes that her central argument is overly simplistic. It's very simple, it's implausibly reductive, or it's too easy. It's the same thing. Let's have a look at other option choices. Choice B. The author of text 1 argues that Tuchman should have relied more on the work of other historians, while the author of text 2 implies that Tuchman's most interesting claims result from her original research. This doesn't accurately describe the difference. This choice's summary of text 1 is accurate, but author 2 never says that Tuckman's most interesting claims result from an original research. This is wrong. So you can easily eliminate option choice D. You have to make sure that both the points agree with our text. In these kind of questions, you will have half of the sentence which is correct, half of the sentence which is not correct. So be very careful. Let's move on to option choice C. The author of text 1 asserts that the writing style of the Guns of August makes it worthwhile to read, despite any perceived deficiency in Tuckman's research, while the author of text 2 focuses exclusively on the weakness of Tuckman's interpretation of events. This doesn't accurately describe the difference again. Author 1 never says that the Guns of August is worthwhile to read, despite its research weaknesses. So we can't just assume this ourselves. Author 2 does call out a weakness of Tuckman's interpretation of events, but it also praises her analysis of primary sources. So be very careful. And exclusively again is an extreme word. Be very careful when you come across such kind of words. The last option, the author of text 1 claims that Tuckman would agree that World War I was largely due to events in Eastern Europe, while the author of text 2 maintains that Tuckman would say that Eastern European leaders were not committed to military plans in the same way that other leaders. Again, doesn't really difference. Says Tuckman fails to address the influence of events in Eastern Europe, while author 2 says that Tuckman's thesis was that European powers, not Eastern European leaders, this is very important. Look how the examiner play around with words. This is crucial. And European leaders were committed to military plans. Hence, you can easily eliminate option choice D as well.